Thank you. Okay, and then we'll share the screen. So thank you for that. Okay, so looks like we're going, and we're going to go now to the regularly scheduled lecture. And thanks again for the help there. So the two elections that really, quite frankly, well, there's been some exciting ones, you know, in my lifetime. Like 1960 was really exciting. 68 was just an absolute blur. It was so interesting. 80 was fun. A lot of these elections just, you know, have a special thing to them, and you remember them well, the debates and all of that. But this one is particularly important, and this is the election of Trump. And how did the former president, President Trump, how did he win? Now, he wasn't even a candidate, as I explained last week. The front runner, key new term here, by the way, the front runner was Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush, very successful governor of Florida. Florida is a key state. You got to win Florida if you want to be president. I mean, that's one of the things for Republicans. They got to win Florida. And he was very popular in that state. And also, by the way, he had the most money. Oh, and he had the best name recognition because his brother had been president, George W. Bush, and his father had been president, George H.W. Bush. And everybody that ever worked with Jeb Bush says he was an amazingly good governor. Took the state through 5 hurricanes in one season and just managed to lead the state brilliantly. Another governor, Chris Christie, was at 10%. Ben Carson was at 7%. Mike Huckabee 6%. Rand Paul at 6%, and Marco Rubio 5%. And these were the main contenders out of a field of 15. So look, can you get the nomination for 23% of the vote? Yes, you can. If the field is what? Split. Now, there was then these debates that happened, and I got to see this one. Like I said, I'm walking along the riverfront in Milwaukee, and this bar, you know, had these big TV screens up, and it was on there. I'm like, crap, I can't miss this. And I sneak in, I'm watching this, and somebody had just entered as a long shot, Donald J. Trump, who had, I used the word last hour, and somebody objected to it. See, Trump has lots of fans. Threatened to run. But I'll just try to say it in a way that's, I guess, politically correct. He teased running for president in the 1980s. He teased again in the 1990s. He teased again that he was going to run in 2008. He never ran. It was all about his brand, you know, and saying, oh, I could be a better president than that person, or whatever. He was never taken seriously. And he wasn't taken seriously here either. And when he throws and actually does run, files the paperwork you need in each state to run, takes a little bit of effort to do that. And he shows up on the debate stage then. And oh my goodness, it was fireworks from day one. This turned out to be quite the fight as former President Trump takes on the front runner and literally humiliates him, calling him low energy, unable to make decisions, ineffective, and all this stuff, which is not true. But it doesn't really matter. He attacks Jeb Bush relentlessly and knocks him off his perch. Did it work? Yes. The front runner, the person that won Iowa, which is the first primary, as we told you, was Ted Cruz, who has a real advantage there. He's an evangelical Christian. He's very strong in that community. A lot of evangelicals that turn out to vote in the Republican Party showed up for him, 27%. But Trump surprised everybody and went from 0 to 24% and took second. Now, the key is you have to be in the top 3, because if you're in the top 3, you collect the most delegates. Now, remember what the game is here. You're going state by state by state, and the people of the Republicans in the state are voting, and it's only a few of the Republicans too. It's not all Republicans, just those that decide to show up to this caucus meeting that I explained last time. And if you get in the top, you get most delegates. So Ted Cruz got the most, Trump the second, and Marco Rubio the third, and that was it. Jeb Bush, the front runner, was knocked down to 6th place, which is dreadful for a front runner. That's not a good place to be. In the first place where they vote in Iowa, the caucuses. Hillary Clinton wasn't doing much better, but her field was smaller. It was a 3-person field. Martin O'Malley didn't do much. He was the governor of Maryland, good candidate, interesting guy, was on the debate stage with these guys, but she is getting tied, literally tied, because there's no way to separate this in a caucus as to who actually really had the most people turn up. But the point of the matter is Bernie Sanders became a force. Now, he'd been in the Senate a long time. Before that, he'd been governor of Burlington, Vermont. Vermont is a very liberal state. He ran as a socialist candidate, so legitimately a socialist, but he's now the leader of the progressive movement in the Democratic Party. Two things were happening here. The Republican Party was being reshaped by Trump, and the Democratic Party was being reshaped by Sanders. And I submit that the Sanders movement is actually bigger than the Trump movement. We'll see as time goes by. But a lot of people got interested. And one of the things that both of them had in common is they were attacking what we call the elite person, the person that's been running the country for all this time. Her husband was president, she was first lady, so whatever. The elite is a term we use for the rich and powerful that tend to get all those leadership positions. And in this case, Donald Trump is attacking Jeb Bush, whose family obviously was about as elite as any family in American history. Then we go to the next state. And the next state was an absolute stunner again. Hillary Clinton loses big time to Bernie Sanders in that state. Okay. And then Donald J. Trump gets 35% of the vote in New Hampshire. And Jeb Bush, once again, finishes outside the money with just 11%. All these candidates had so badly split the vote that you could get the majority of delegates out of the states with just 25 to 35%. Sanders, on the other hand, walked away with a whopping number of delegates in New Hampshire when he won 60%. Suddenly, we had a very interesting presidential election underfoot. Now, I'm going to take just a little bit of a break from the election, and we're going to now kind of focus on Utah just a little bit. And we're going to jump ahead to the actual election itself in November, right? Let's take a look at Utah. Utah becomes the major thorn in the side of the presidency of candidacy of Donald J. Trump. Utah became, well, the rebel alliance. It became the state that starts the Never Trump movement. It puts Utah in just a very interesting position. It kind of puts it in a special place in history, because here's what happened in that fall election. We had Donald J. Trump, by the way, when he came to Utah, everywhere he was going, big crowds, filling stadiums. Not in Utah, barely a little bar managed to fill it. That was it. Bernie Sanders comes and he fills, it could have been between 15 and 30,000 people went up near the U of U to a park out there to hear Bernie Sanders speak. It was fascinating to watch this state. It was the most interesting presidential election I've ever experienced in the state of Utah. Clinton would go on to win 27.5%. That's Hillary Clinton. But who's this guy with 21%? He was an anti-Trump Republican who'd worked for Mitt Romney and other people who decided on a strategy that wasn't really crazy. The way the Electoral College is structured, remember, that's really what this whole lecture is about. The way the Electoral College is structured, if no one gets a majority, in other words, 270 to win, you need 270 electors. If nobody gets a majority, then the top three candidates are thrown to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives gets to pick the president from the top three vote getters. That's the tiebreaker. You don't get 50% plus one, 270, then it goes to the House of Representatives. So here was his play. Hillary Clinton, Donald J. Trump are going to split the vote. So if I can win just one state, just one, and get the 6 electoral votes from Utah, that's all I got to do, then I'll be one of the 3 candidates that will face off in the House if nobody gets 270. It wasn't a crazy play. The problem is that the Hillary Clinton people wouldn't budge and switch over. And so as a result, it kind of fell apart, and Trump was able to take the state. Remember, 65% of the people in Utah voted against Donald J. Trump, and there's a reason for it, which we'll explain tomorrow. Here's kind of how Utah voted. Look at the counties that are very highly Democratic. This is Park City and Salt Lake City, right? A little bit down here, but this whole state is red Republican through and through, but not in its biggest urban area, nor in the area where it has attracted so many out-of-staters, Park City, people from California and other places. All right, meanwhile, back at the ranch, you also need to remember how many electoral votes Utah has. So by show of hands, and I'll be watching, use your hands and tell me how many electoral votes does Utah have? It's 6. Right? So this works, I guess, right? Okay. Or this works, but it's not that. I kind of tried to cheat here a little bit, see, in the 4 up there. But these are our 4 members of the House. These are 4 members of the House of Representatives who represent District 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is where this lecture gets a little bit detailed here. Utah is divided up into 4 districts. Now, I got to be honest with you, the districts look a little strange. They look strained. They look like somebody's been messing with the map. How do you determine, right, where these districts are drawn? Well, it's simple. We have a census every 10 years. The census tells us how many people live in Utah, right? How many people live in the rest of the country. Then you take the whole population of people and you divide it by the number of the members of the House. How many House members are there? 435, right? Which we talked about in the last lecture. So lots of numbers are going to be in the study guide, lots of little numbers, right? They serve for 2 years and they run again every 2 years, right? And Utah got enough population, roughly somewhere between 800,000, around 800,000 people gets you another member of the House. And then the state legislature draws these lines. Now, if you're very clever about drawing the lines, even though we know that at least a third of Utah are Democrats, especially in Salt Lake City and Park City, if you split that up and you chop Salt Lake City into 3 pieces extra and give them to high density Republican districts, you can make sure that the Democrats never win a House seat. I mean, you think about it, if you're going to be fair about it, right? If you have 25% Democrats and 75% Republican voters, then maybe it should be like 3 members of the House are Republican and 1's a Democrat, but that's not how the game is played. The game is mathematically, you can control less than 50%, but less than 50% of the state. But if you do it right, you can still get 3 out of 4. Or if you have 55%, you can ensure that you get 4 out of 4. So in other words, 45% of Utahns aren't going to get somebody that represents their political party. The most interesting district is this one in purple. It's the 4th district. This is the one belonging to Burgess who? Owens, and I still don't have a card for him. So somebody please find one and let's get it up there. But here's this picture right here, Burgess Owens. He ran a very good campaign against a very popular member of Congress. This district has changed hands every single 2 years since it was made. It starts out with a Democrat who won by like 500 votes. Then the Republican wins by about 1,000. Then the Democrat wins by about 1,000. And now he wins by about 1,000. It's too close. It's what we call a swing district. It's one of the few swing districts in the country. Most districts are gerrymandered, so they're completely, totally safe. 1, 2, and 3 are totally safe. The Republicans don't even have to campaign, and they're going to win those districts. Curtis can be in the House of Representatives as long as he wants to. He will never be voted out unless there's some major scandal surrounding his life, which there won't be. Moore, when he got this, how are these people picked? They're picked in the primaries. Now listen very carefully. When you vote in November, most of the candidates have already been picked. For example, let's take our governor. Governor Cox is a Republican. Guess what? He won in the Republican Party in a very heated contest. There were 4 candidates, right? Now, he was not the front runner. The front runner is a former governor named Huntsman, and a good guy, but he'd been ambassador for Donald Trump in China. And so here's the deal, right? The party is split. So you have one candidate that's really, really pro-Trump. Another one, I can't remember what he was about. The other one was kind of trying to walk the middle between the Trump supporters and the non-Trump supporters, and that was Huntsman. And this guy right here just said, I'm not going to play that kind of politics at all. I'm just going to run based on the issues in Utah. And he was a young kid who never should have been governor. Huntsman should have been governor. But the vote got split. And he got a lot of support because he wasn't being political. He was talking about issues that affect Utah. He won in the primary. So when you get to November and the Utahns are voting for governor, everybody, this is everybody's attitude. I'm going to vote. You show up for vote. And by the way, the decision's already been made. Trump has already won the electoral votes because he got the nomination. Cox is already going to be governor because he's the Republican nominee. And your congressman, with the only exception, if you lived in this purple district, Democrats had a chance. And it was close. But Curtis, yeah. And many people then say, why vote? Because it's already been decided. If you don't get involved in the primary process, most of the candidates have already been pre-selected for you. Owen's case was different. He had to fight, really a good candidate in the Democratic side. But here's how you defeat the Democrat. You take Salt Lake City. Now remember this previous map. Look at that. See the dominance there? You take it and you give part of it to this district, but then you add in much of Utah County, Nephi, and this area in Mount Pleasant. You add a bunch of area to offset, and they literally know by street, every person and how they tend to vote and who they donate to. It's that granular. All this data is public data. They know where the Democrats live. They know where the Republicans live. They know what the voting patterns are. And if you're clever and you have a young person with a computer, they can calculate how many votes are needed to offset this southern section of Salt Lake City. This is the weirdest one. Here's the guy that represents St. George and all these rural areas. They took his district all the way through Tooele and took up the northern part of Salt Lake City and Bountiful and this area here to make the safest district in the state, but take a big chunk of Democratic voters away from Salt Lake City. And then they did the same thing here, taking a big chunk of Salt Lake voters and carving it up so that they can potentially win 4 out of 4, even though, well, look, if we had a commission doing this in a kind of an objective manner, Salt Lake City would be its own district. Utah County would pretty much be its own district. That'd be 1 and 2. And the 2 rural areas would be 2 districts all by themselves. But that's not how it's done. It's done by a process called gerrymandering. By the way, don't forget, we have 2 senators, right? So you got your 4 congressmen, 2 senators, 6 electoral votes. So 4, remember these 4, how long are these people elected for? What's their term of office? Their term is how many years? 2. These guys run for how many years? 6. Their term is 6 years. But you add them together, you get 6 electoral votes. So that's just a quick review. The idea of gerrymandering goes back as almost as old as the Republic. The first time we really see it is in 1812. By the way, this should be 1817 too. But anyway, the guy was the governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry. And he created this monstrous gerrymander. See this here, monster? This is how it was depicted in the paper. And the term gerrymander was invented, right? So you meander the lines, and Jerry's the one that does it to make sure your side always wins. Safe district. It was drawn on a map and signed into law. Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, did this. It's called redistricting. When they redistricted Massachusetts following the 1810 census, he made sure that his party always had more members of Congress than the opposition. It was designed specifically to keep the party in power in the upcoming election. The whole country is gerrymandered. Utah's not the only one playing this game. In fact, Utah's kind of an amateur at it. Other places, it's much more sophisticated. Take a look at this gerrymandered district near Chicago.
Oh my gosh, what is that?
These are just streets where nobody lives on. They just kind of go down until you get a pocket of this party, this party. This is a Democratic gerrymander. These are Democrats. These are Democrats. There's more here. There's more. Just enough to offset any potential Republican. If they just drew it right here, it could probably be a swing district. Well, now that's illogical. It is. But the whole country is divided up. Texas is the most gerrymandered state. Republicans have controlled that state legislature forever. And there are very few, even though half the population now is Latino. How many Latinos get elected to the House in Texas? That's being litigated in court right now. The Supreme Court can't step in and ask them to redistrict. The gerrymander in Utah was funny because when we only had 3, they tried to get rid of this guy here who was a Democrat, right? This district here, Owens was his name, very popular, always won. So they gerrymandered him out of existence and created a new 4th district where he didn't live. His district, right, was gerrymandered out of existence. So he runs here and he did win again, but it didn't last. It only lasted 2 years. And then he was thrown out because it's so gerrymandered. When we got to 4, that's when they got rid of him. And the guy had to make sure that member of the House, who was very popular in Utah, especially in rural areas. I mean, he was, anyway, out he goes. Well, now let's get back to the Electoral College. Now, if you're looking at every district in the country using these little cubes here, that shows you what the country really is like. When you look at the big electoral maps, I'm going to see if I can find one really fast. I don't want to spend too much time. Okay, there you go. It looks like, oh man, Republicans control most of the country. Well, in this particular election, they actually did. This was the Trump 2016 election. But the red is bigger on the map because it includes such big states like, oh, I don't know. Let's take a look at Wyoming and Montana. And yeah, that's right. The population density is very low in Nebraska, Kansas, and these areas. And even the southern states have less population. So when you look at the color coding from a demographic perspective, demographics is a key word you're going to have to learn, and that is the counting of the population and where people live and how they live. For example, these districts right here, these are strong Democratic districts. That's Austin, Texas, basically. This is the border region around San Antonio and Dallas. But the rest of the state is pretty red. This group right here dominates politics. So most of the members of the House are Republican. It doesn't reflect this map at all. This is the most interesting, I think, is Illinois. That big blue blob is Chicago, just the city of Chicago. And that's its population relative to the rest of the state, which tends to be very conservative, very red. And it's true everywhere you go. I mean, you can sit there and you look at it. Now, when we get back to the election of 2016, so the actual vote is in 2016, the campaign starts in 2015 and then goes through 16, and then the president doesn't take office until January of 17. Okay, don't be confused by that. So the campaign actually, is 15 into 16. And 16, this guy is drawing crowds like you wouldn't believe. He's got the best campaign slogan I think anybody's ever thought of. Make America great again. It implies what? What does it imply? America's not great anymore. And of course, the person they're looking at is Obama. Obama, we got to get rid of Obama. Well, Obama wasn't running. He'd done his 8 years, and so whatever. But you can't let another elite like Hillary Clinton take charge. Make America great again. Lock Hillary Clinton up. Obama's history. I'm going to come in and change things. And this populism works. Rarely in American politics. Did you hear what I just said? Populism rarely works in American politics. There's only been, that I can think of, 2 populist presidents. There's been some, well, 3. There's been some populist other people, like Bernie Sanders is a populist, you'd have to say. And we're going to talk about another man here in a second, William Jennings Bryan. But Jefferson hated the idea of populism. Why? Because it's not tied up into logic and thinking, it's tied up into emotion. Populism, rare in American history, refers to a range of political stances that emphasize the idea of the people, average everyday folks, juxtaposed, in other words, fighting against the elite or the establishment. And you'll hear that term, the establishment. I should probably have it bolded on this. The establishment, well, of the 2 candidates, Donald J. Trump and Hillary Clinton, who's the establishment? Hillary Clinton. Her husband had been president. She'd been Secretary of State. She'd been a senator. Populist parties and social movements are often led by charismatic or dominant figures. You can't really have populism without a lot of charisma. And basically, they become the voice of the people as they define it, right? The first populist president was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the first populist, where he inspired average everyday folks to kind of wake up out of their little world and get involved politically. Now, that was very hard at the time. Listen very carefully. This is an important piece of the puzzle. So those of you who aren't listening right now, I need you to listen. Only the elites could vote back in Andrew Jackson's day. When he ran in 1824, states determine who can vote. And the states you had to have a certain amount of property, you had to be certain wealthy, or you had to be of the top, what we would call today the 1%. It was the elites that could vote. Average everyday people couldn't. So Jackson's populism, well, it wasn't going to work in this first election because the elites are the only ones that could really have a say. Now, some states like Pennsylvania were allowing more and more people to vote. But Andrew Jackson lost his first election. I'll go into that detail later. And what he did in his new party that was founded in and around him called the Democratic Party. Democratic means the people get a say. The Democratic Party was born and went state by state by state to get them to change the voting rules so that any white man, regardless of property, wealth, or even literacy, could vote. So you could be an illiterate white male and vote when the states changed those rules. So state by state was changing the rules. Why? So suddenly now there was a new demographic of voters that had never voted before, that were blocked by the law. And that is who Jackson spoke to, and they turned out in massive numbers for him, and he wins the next election in 1828. I'll show you those numbers at a later time. But they had a lot in common. Andrew Jackson complained that the current president, his name was John Quincy Adams, probably the most prepared person ever to take the presidency since George Washington, was elite and corrupt, and he hired all these corrupt people, and he was going to end that corruption. A new broom, he said, sweeps clean. In other words, I'm going to sweep out all of these alligators out of the swamp. And he literally goes in and fires half the government and installs people of his own choosing. It's called the spoils system, and we'll talk more about that later as well. But he also, right, Donald J. Trump had one of the same lines: drain the swamp, get rid of all the corrupt elites in Washington. And it's no surprise to me that when the president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, got to choose the portrait of a president that he wanted to hang behind him in the Oval Office for the next 4 years, he would choose Andrew Jackson, which becomes just a little bit awkward when, you guys know Jackson's history, the Cherokee Trail of Tears, how he forced all Native Americans that he could get out of the east part of the United States across the Mississippi River. The Cherokee, particularly in winter, lost 5,000 people on that march, literally escorted by gunpoint by the US Army. That president? Well, when Trump met the Navajo Code Talkers, heroes of World War II, to give them a commemorative medal, because, by the way, they're all getting really old now, he presents it underneath the portrait of Andrew Jackson. It was awkward at best. Look, everybody knows the story. He's got a White House staff. They could have moved to the East Room under maybe Teddy Roosevelt's picture or whatever. Then he mocks a candidate, Elizabeth Warren, because Elizabeth Warren claims a little bit of Native American history, and he mocked her by calling her Pocahontas. She's a fake Native American. She just says she, anyway, it's a long story, but it's an interesting thing. But here's where they differ a lot, and that is Jackson would win 2 terms, but although also Jackson's party would set up the country in the next 30 years for the Civil War, because he never dealt with the issue of slavery. He had the power to deal with it. There were ways to deal with it. There were ways to change the country, to get out of that nightmare. And his party, he was from Tennessee, from the Appalachian area. Remember that map I showed you, right? Of the 11 nations? Appalachia is different than the Deep South. I should have had you write about that. But the point is that his brand of politics is still with us. But Andrew Jackson did something that Mr. Trump promised to do in the campaign. Donald J. Trump, when he promised, he said, I will pay the national debt down to 0 by the end of my 2nd term, just like Andrew Jackson did. Listen very carefully. I shall say this only once. Well, maybe I'll say it again, but Andrew Jackson was the only president, listen to me, the only president in American history to pay the national debt to 0, ever. And you see that Trump didn't even get close. He ran up the debt big time with a huge tax cut that went mostly to the wealthiest Americans, and then also to Then COVID hits and we weren't ready for it. So here's the problem we've had. Yes, we borrowed heavily to win World War II, but notice we were paying it back. And if we just stayed on the path that Eisenhower and Kennedy and Nixon and other presidents have put us on, had we stayed on that path, well, we would be more to zero now. I mean, it would be down there. There's the green line, but we didn't. Instead, in 1980, we elected Ronald Reagan, who also promised to bring the debt to zero. But the first thing he did was to cut taxes. Now, that's okay. Taxes needed to go down a little bit, quite frankly. That's okay, except you have to offset it with what? Spending. If you don't bring in as much money, you got to cut your spending. And Reagan didn't do that. Reagan instead went on a spending spree for military equipment. It shot our debt up $5 trillion during his presidency. Because we were still in the Cold War, and of course we had to stay ready, and end that Cold War. And so many people say, well, that ended the Cold War. It didn't help Russia that we were outspending them like 10 to 1. But by the same token, then you shouldn't have cut taxes so much. It needs to be a balance, a careful balance. This is what it means to be a fiscal conservative. Get the debt down, don't spend more than you bring in. Reagan preached a good story, but it didn't result in a practice. So the president that had to take the bullet was George H.W. Bush, one of my favorite presidents. George H.W. Bush had to fight a war in the Middle East, the successful one, Operation Desert Storm. Remember we talked about that one? But also too, he saw this rising debt and he said, look, I've got to raise taxes a little bit on those who can maybe afford to pay a little bit more. But he'd campaigned 4 years earlier saying, read my lips, no new taxes. I'm going to be like Reagan, no new taxes. And then he got and looked at the budget and says, we don't raise taxes. This is a nightmare scenario. So he raised taxes and he lost his presidency for it. He did the right thing and lost his presidency. The party was split. He loses his presidency to Bill Clinton, who only won something like 42% of the vote. But by cutting those taxes, he made it real easy for the Republicans that control the House and the Senate to work with Bill Clinton, a Democrat. And by the time Bill Clinton leaves office, we're on the right track again from a fiscal conservative perspective. Because the point is that the last 3 years of Clinton, we had a surplus. We actually had money to pay off the principal of the debt. You all know that from your finance class, right? So we're doing it. And then George H.W. Bush's son, George Bush, comes in and says, well, look, things are going so good. Let's do another tax cut. Did another tax cut. Then we have the Great Recession and costs go through the roof. And he took it another many trillions of dollars. Plus he fought the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq at the same time, and he's cutting taxes. So here's another president who promises to reduce the debt and takes it just the opposite direction. Republican, Republican, Republican. Ran on the issue. 3 ran on the issue of controlling the debt, and only 1 did. He lost his presidency over it. So then Obama inherits the Great Recession, and it takes a year to get the economy turned around where we start creating positive job growth. Now, let me tell you this story here in a hurry. Obama achieved a modern economic miracle with, believe it or not, some help from George W. Bush passing some laws that were able to get some funding in here before Obama took office, handing him basically $750 billion. And then Obama able to pass his own stimulus package far below what Biden's got through. It was less than $1 trillion. Managed to get the economy back on track. And after the first year, for the next 7 years, the economy created positive job growth every single year. The month Obama took office, we lost nearly 1 million jobs. And now we've gone 7 years with positive job growth. And the Obama recovery, it's called, continued for the next 3 years of the Trump presidency. It was 10 years of positive job growth. Never seen it before in American history. Not that long. Until what hit? And if you wonder, why is Mr. Barksdale obsessing so much about the COVID thing? Because it's going to bring down one president And it has the potential to bring down another one, Trump and Biden. So you don't mess with pandemics or they mess back. But here is where he differs from Andrew Jackson, who was the only president to ever what? Zero the national debt. And we've squandered opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. Now, the former president, Trump, toyed with running in the 80s and the 90s and in the 2000s. And he never followed through. But after Obama won the election in 2008, he starts to question whether Obama actually was a US citizen and qualified to be president. Now, he's only doing this for publicity because he's making all this stuff up. That's a fact. So if you're a Trump supporter, get over it. This was a bald-faced lie. The qualifications to be president is you must be a natural-born US citizen, 35 years of age and 14 years a resident. Does Obama check all three of those boxes? Yes. He was born in the state of what? Hawaii. Last time I checked, it was still had a star on the flag, but it doesn't really matter. There's a lot of people that didn't like Obama, and as a result, loved the fact that this potential candidate for president in the future was going to make trouble for him. And so he challenges his birth certificate. No, it's never been done in American history. Grabbed a lot of headlines. Here's the tape, one of the interviews.
The State Department, the U.S. State Department recognizes these as legitimately.
It's not a birth certificate, Candy, and people are trying to figure out why isn't he giving his birth certificate? It's not a birth certificate.
He had a birth certificate. They posted it online from the White House, but that's not a birth certificate, he says. Listen to the argument.
Certificate of live birth, and you can see that one that you have and the one that I brought you, because that's the one that's on the internet and all over the place. It doesn't even have a serial number. It doesn't have a signature. It doesn't have a signature. One that I saw on television has a stamp, but that's not a signature.
Right, but that's how they.
Excuse me, but that's not the one that they were showing to everybody. And I just say very simply, why doesn't he show?
It was a standard Hawaiian birth certificate that they give to every Hawaiian.
His birth certificate. Why has he spent over $2 million in legal fees to keep this quiet and to keep this? When I
Never happened.
listened today to the tape of the grandmother, and she was saying he was born essentially in Kenya, and then all of a sudden, don't forget, this is when Barack Obama was hot as a pistol because it looked like he was going to get the nomination, and they had a lot of people, a lot of handlers in there. And all of a sudden you hear people all over the room, no, he was born in Hawaii. He was born in Hawaii. But
Obama's father was from Kenya. Grandma's proud of the fact that a Kenyan is rising to the presidency of the United States. And her statement was twisted in order to make it sound, oh no, he was born here. These are all lies.
she was
There was a misinterpretation.
Misinterpretation.
She was like, there were a lot of people in that room, and she said Kenya, he was born right here. And then they started saying, screaming, no, you mean Hawaii, you mean Hawaii. There's
They
a
say
lot
it's
of
an interpretation.
Look, I don't like to talk about this issue too much because I really would rather talk about China. I would really rather talk about what OPEC is doing to destroy us. I would really rather talk about other things. But I'll be honest with you. I started this and I heard the question for the first time 4 weeks ago. And I assumed, although I had heard about it for years, I assumed that he was born in the United States, meaning in Hawaii. I assumed that. The more I go into it, the more suspect it is.
Two quick things here, Elliot.
He goes on to say he has people in Hawaii checking this, like, I don't know, detectives or whatever, which also wasn't true. It doesn't matter. He is trying to delegitimize President Obama in hopes of maybe running himself one day. And it worked.
One is that there is a certificate of live birth that has the stamp of the state of Hawaii and a signature on it that is out there. Number of people have gone there, checked it out. The tape recording he's talking about, an interview with Barack Obama's grandmother on his father's side, where she, according to those in the room, mistakenly misunderstood what was going on in the interpretation. A lot of people say, listen, you know, she didn't understand. He was born in Hawaii. Others say, no, she said the truth. So it's the kind of thing I said to him, this is going to go on for, this is a conspiracy theory. This is going to go on for 20 years. And he said, but it shouldn't. So he's found this issue. He certainly is writing it. We talked about a lot of other things, Libya and the economy, but this is something that he has grabbed onto. It's made him quite popular among those within the Republican Party who believe this. And he is not to be deterred, no matter how much evidence you put out there. He thinks there is more to this, despite, you know, sort of paper after paper.
You know, I don't believe that all those Republicans believed it either, but it was a way to get at Obama. And so it's called the birther conspiracy. It actually has a name in history, the birther movement, the birther conspiracy. So let's go ahead and get back to where we were on the lecture. Now we can go into this in a lot of detail here, but guess what? One of the key opponents to Trump was Ted Cruz from Texas, who was actually born in Canada. Can he run for president? He did. He used this attack again and again. It was interesting to see how this happens. And there's other things we can play just for fun. But whose spin becomes the truth? A famous radio broadcaster once said, named Rush Limbaugh, if you can spin it and you say it enough, some people might actually believe it. I love this guy, Glenn Beck. He said, when did opinion become fact? And we have this media, right, that's hungry for a story. So what you learn is, for example, people like Rush Limbaugh, if it was a slow news day, would say something very outrageous and provocative, like Obama wasn't born in the United States, maybe. And then the other side of the media would react to that, and they'd get going in a back and forth, and all of their ratings go up. The controversy creates good ratings. This is what Facebook knows, right? Anger, resentment, and fear is what drives clicks. It drives people watching and reading papers and looking at blogs and all that kind of stuff too. And we have a spectrum of media that's hungry for the story. CNN, who's kind of in the middle, is fact-checking this story that comes from over here. But you know what? They wouldn't be covering it if it wasn't amusing and it drove up their ratings. Every single person on this list is a business, and they're in the business of making money. And you don't need to have a big audience to do that. 1 or 2 million listeners, and you're going to make a fortune. And it doesn't matter really what you say or what the facts are. What matters is the controversy. And if you don't have a good controversy going on, like this birther movement, where's the birth certificate? We saw posters like this in Utah. People paid for this. Where's the birth certificate? Yeah, did anybody remember that? Really, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, that you'd still remember. It's all about blogs, it's about websites, it's about social media, and it's about cable news networks making money. Money's at the heart of this. Okay, so now let's define what it means to be a natural born citizen. And what I'm going to do is stop right there, because whenever I taught this before, it was like, duh, you know, nobody cared. But this birther conspiracy, now we got to nail it down. The reason we don't know what it means to be a natural born citizen is because the Supreme Court has never heard a case and defined it for us. It's a vague reference in the Constitution. Remember I said the Constitution wasn't completely 100% nailed down when they left? How old you got to be? How old's Washington? Okay, 35 and older. Okay, what else? You should be in the country for the last, why? They did not want a foreign person coming over and be here for like a month and taking the office. A foreign prince, for example. They're worried about a real situation of maybe some leader from France, a populist leader from France, or popular leader from England coming over here and becoming the American president. So they tried to create some safeguards for that time period in 1789 to prevent somebody who wasn't truly connected to the country, who had citizenship, from becoming president. And so that's why this was put in. Very simple, natural born, whatever that means, 35 years old, and you have to be in residence in this country for 14 years. Can you be a US ambassador to China and still qualify? Yeah, you're still serving the country if you're in the military, for example. So we'll go through the details tomorrow on what that natural born we think means, but we will never know what it means until who decides to have a case on it. And they're never going to hear a case on it. They won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So I guess it's open to interpretation. I don't know. That's a good place to leave it. Let's go ahead and stop the share. Now, what was the point of former President Trump doing this? Did he get attention? Yes, he did. And did it work? Yes, it did. It was the first step toward him being president of the United States. It wasn't